It was almost 2 years ago that I started work on a small log cabin in the northern Canadian bush. And it has been exactly a year since I closed the cabin door for the last time and moved away. Finally, I got the chance to return, and I am anxious to see how the cabin has fared the last 4 seasons on its own. While most parts of North America are enjoying mild spring weather with no snow, my aluminum snowshoes are falling through waist-deep powder in temperatures of minus 20 degrees Celsius. Although this looks like January weather, would you believe that this is late April? It's been a long, hard winter here. Lots of snow and a solid month of minus 40 degree temperatures. There were even a few days that registered right around minus 50. It seems that the lynx population has been hit the hardest this winter. Several locals have reported that their dogs have been attacked by lynx along the hiking trails. Normally, lynx avoid this sort of contact with bigger dogs and humans, but the prolonged cold temperatures have forced them to make desperate decisions. It wasn't far from here that I spotted a mother lynx and her 2 cubs last year. And of course, I didn't have my camera ready at the time. On my way into the cabin, yet another lynx had silently stalked behind me for a short distance, but it eventually turned off my path and took a different direction. And I wouldn't have noticed it at all if it weren't for the footprints it left behind over my fresh tracks. In building the cabin, I wanted it to be simple for 2 reasons. Number 1, because of the cabin's location, I knew that I'd be having to do everything by hand. Getting the equipment and supplies in, moving and hoisting the logs would all have to be done with good old-fashioned manpower. And reason number 2, I didn't have a lot of money to work with. Simple as that. And in this complicated world, simple just seems to offer more. Complicated offers bells and whistles, but simple offers freedom. Although some would argue that this cabin wasn't built to code, it is still perfectly legal. That's because it's built on privately owned property, and the local government doesn't require a permit for any structure that is 10 feet by 10 feet or under. And this log cabin just so happens to be exactly 10 feet by 10 feet. So yes, I'm aware that building my logs right on the ground without proper footings and not debarking them means that they will not last a full century, like they could have if I had done all these things. But that's just fine. These logs will probably last at least a quarter century without any need for repairs. And so far, the cabin has settled and dried out quite nicely, and the bottom rows don't show any signs of rotting in the near future. I am also aware that I'm using a tarp to cover the roof, and contrary to popular belief, it is not instantly disintegrated or even began to fade yet. Besides, tarps can be replaced easily enough, and at low cost, so even if I have to replace it every 5 to 10 years or so, it won't be a problem. I'll just make sure to buy the heavy-duty kind. And yes, I know that there are gaps in my door, and that it most definitely isn't bear-proof, but in the winter time, when there's a draft, I just place a blanket over the door and it stays quite warm and cozy inside. As for the bears, I haven't had any try to come inside yet, and if they do, they're not going to find it too terribly interesting. There's no food, and I didn't leave any fine china behind for Mr. Bear to break. Anyway, I like the door, and so it stays, gaps and all. Did I mention that it used to be a coffee table? My point is, there will always be some who will find fault in this simple design, but all I know is that it works for me. And at the end of it all, I only spent about $500 on the entire cabin, and most of that money went into the lumber I used in the roof. If I wasn't planning on moving at the time, I would have taken longer to construct the roof out of smaller logs, which would have significantly brought down the cost that much more. But I don't regret a single decision I made in the cabin's construction. Upon entering the cabin, I could see signs that there had been a visitor in my absence. A couple wads of insulation along the top logs and a pile of pine nuts on the shelf told me that a squirrel had stopped by for a visit at some point. Oh well, no harm done. It wasn't anything that 15 minutes of dusting couldn't fix. When I stepped back outside, I was surprised to see an old friend. Meet Charles. When I first started building the cabin, Charles would always fly past between 10:30 and 11:30 a.m. every morning. He always flew toward the west, and he was always 100 meters to the south of me. It was his morning routine. After a while, instead of simply flying past, Charles would break from his scheduled flight plan to circle overhead a few times. I figured it was his way of saying hello. Eventually, when Charles came overhead my little clearing in the bush, he would stop to land on a nearby tree to watch as I worked, and in this way we kept each other company. It was then that I named him Charles, and this is how our relationship continued until I moved away. Every day he'd come to visit between 10:30 and 11 a.m. He would call and I would call back at him. And so you can imagine how happy I was to see him again, over a year later. He perched on a nearby tree when I arrived, and so I'd like to think that he recognized me. It's always good seeing an old friend, even if he is an old crow. So what started me on this simple cabin project? Well, I'm a youth pastor, and my church owns some bush property. And so I figured building a log cabin on the property would be a great project for my youth group to work together on. And although I worked alone most of the time, the youth would get together and join me on a Saturday from time to time, or for a couple hours after school. It was a great opportunity for them to learn new skills, make friends, and gain confidence in themselves. On other occasions, a friend would join me for an afternoon to help out. Sometimes there were people who I barely knew that wanted to lend a hand. So, if nothing else, I made a lot of good friends during the construction of this cabin. And so, when the cabin was complete, I donated it to the church and the youth group. Someday I'll build my own log cabin, but a piece of me will always be with this one, tucked away somewhere in the northern Canadian wilderness. If you'd like to know more about this log cabin, simply click the link to view the next video. If you liked today's episode, anything to do with log cabins, survival, or wild edibles, then please feel free to subscribe. I'm The Outsider saying, until next time.